Hi, welcome to Astro Portraits from Planetary Calendars. I'm Ralph Demetrius, one of the astrologers. The portrait this week is of a city. It's of Washington, D.C. And it's an interesting case because, remember, it was founded in 1790. So they'd only discovered Uranus a few years, really, not that many years before then, 25 years before then. They had not yet discovered Neptune nor Pluto. So when they cast the chart, because remember, these things were carefully planned, just like the chart for the United States of America. When they cast this chart, they knew certain features, but they didn't know all of the features. And the chart is for July 16th, 1790, and as in all city charts, we use noontime. It means everything is out in the open. The sun is at 24 degrees Cancer. Mercury is also in Cancer. The rising is Libra. Now, this is the same sun rising as in the United States of America. The United States in a noontime chart has Libra rising. The United States, it's a partnership. And this is the capital for the United States, therefore Libra rising, and it's also the place of laws. And this is why they've always said the United States of America is a place of laws. It's Libra rising. That's the first impression you have. The moon is in Virgo. Now, a lot of charts related to Washington, D.C. have prominent Virgo in them. And the reason is it was the symbol that was very important to the Masons. It was the symbol of service to humanity, the symbol of the Virgin, which, the concept of Virgo went back to the great goddess. That's what the constellation was called beforehand. So it was the adoration of the goddess. And what's interesting is that the Federal Triangle, which, is the core of the capital, is laid out in the same shaped triangle as is formed between three major stars: Spica, Regulus, and Bootes. It's a triangle. Well, what's interesting is that in this chart, Jupiter was conjunct Regulus. The ascendant was loosely conjunct Spica. But this is where it gets real interesting. It's the issue of unintended consequences, which is practically the name of any type of government planning. At the rising is 19 degrees Libra. Well, at the time, there was no major planet there that they could see. In the United States chart, when they calculated that, Saturn was rising. And that was because Saturn was about being solid and being on strong foundations. And Saturn in Libra is what's called the exalted position. It's a very strong external position for the chart. But there was no planet rising that they knew about. Who was rising in the chart when they found it? Washington, D.C. Neptune, a symbol that very much symbolizes our belief in things. It also symbolizes, among other things, petrochemicals and chemistry generally. And it's funny because, petrochemicals and power and gas and such have had a lot of influence on the power structure in Washington, D.C. Now, it also relates to gases, which is kind of funny because, politicians are oftentimes described as gas bags because they never stop talking. That's probably not the most polite way to put it, but, if you listen to enough news, you get that impression. The other players that were there, okay, in the United States chart, they knew that Mars was in Gemini. Okay, Mars is highly elevated. Now, Mars in Gemini has a lot to do with why Americans are so mobile. In the chart for Washington, D.C., Mars is in Virgo, the other Mercury-ruled sign, conjunct the moon in the 12th house. So these were really the rising planets. These were the planets they could see rising in the east, or they knew were rising in the east. It had a lot to do with dealing with the details of government. Keeping all of the records. The Vestal Virgins in ancient Rome were the keepers of the wills. This was their job, besides being, keeping the torch burning, being priestesses. Their job was to keep the wills and documents. They were the organizers, this group of women. And having Virgo so prominent, Mars and the moon and Jupiter in the 12th house in Virgo had to do with being the repository of information, the Library of Congress, the important documents that we basically decide our collective fate based upon are kept there in the 12th house. The 12th house is the house of government. It's basically that which serves selflessly based upon our collective belief. What's interesting is that highly elevated is Mercury, and it's in what's called the Gogolon spot. It's basically to the right of the midheaven, basically to the west of the midheaven. Planets that are above the horizon or to the west of the midheaven have a lot of leverage. It's in Mercury in Cancer, so it has a lot to do with taking care of people and taking care of children. And of course, a great deal of government is about taking care of children. What's interesting is that Chiron is there. They didn't know that at the time. Chiron wasn't discovered until, I think, 1970, if I recall. It is known as the wounded healer, but it has a lot to do with the mind-body connection, what you might call holistic healing. Conjunct Mercury, it meant that as time went on, part of the mission would be recognizing people as complete beings and recognizing, those who have been wounded by society, those who have, and especially mothers who have been wounded, because it's in Cancer. In the chart, Venus is in Gemini, okay? What's also interesting is that Uranus, another planet that they had finally just recently discovered, but I don't think they were tracking. I don't think astrologers at that time had ephemerized for them. It's Uranus and Leo in the 11th house. Now, whether or not you decide that Uranus has a connection to Aquarius, it does have a great deal to do with electricity. And the 11th house has a lot to do with electricity. It has to do with networks. So having Uranus in the 11th house shows that the United States would be great leaders or innovators in technology. Now, I grew up in New Jersey. I no longer live there. But I grew up very close to the labs of Thomas Edison. And then later on, I worked in the town of Edison, very close to his original labs. Like two different ones. One was in West Orange, one was in just outside of Metuchen, Menlo Park specifically. It was the land of invention. I knew people. I grew up with people who invented significant things. It was where the great labs were. This Uranus and Leo in the house of technology shows Washington being connected to this. Why would Washington be connected to it? Why would Washington, D.C. be connected to it? The patent office was everything to the early inventors, your ability to patent your inventions. And some of the skullduggery that went on with the patent office is really famous. In fact, Bell, who we credit with inventing the telephone, his father-in-law was actually the director of the patent office. And when he went to patent his telephone, his father-in-law actually jiggled some papers to give him credit for things that Bell never did. And in fact, when Bell finally started developing the telephone, he had to work with Edison because it was Edison who invented the microphone. And yet they had both put it in patents, but Bell's was post-dated by his father-in-law. This is the story, at least. But this is what was involved. It was your ability to get a patent in place. That's why Washington was so important. Washington, D.C., the keeper of the records. Now, what's also interesting is that Pluto is in the 5th house. Pluto is also conjunct Astraea, a planet that relates, or an asteroid that relates very strongly to legal issues. This sounds like Ruth Bader Ginsburg to me. Pluto, the power of the small to change things, being creative in their thinking, being creative thinkers, innovative thinkers. Astraea, the law. But it has a lot to do with the United States of America, and in Washington, D.C. specifically, creating laws that had a great deal with changing how people could be creative. And that's really one of the ways in which Washington, I think, has excelled. The development of patent laws, the types of laws that we have very much promoted human creativity, in ways that had not been addressed since very, very ancient times, probably, in our recorded history. But that was another thing that they had encountered on that Uranus in the 11th house. Invention, the leaders of invention, Neptune at the rising, the fact that we believe in Washington. Washington, D.C. is, it's a spiritual icon to Americans. This is why the whole place was done in white marble and white granite. It's this symbol to us. It's funny, when you go into many of these buildings, are very kind of, run-of-the-mill office buildings. But when you walk around Washington, D.C. with the monuments, it gives you a great sense of your belief in the idea of Washington. And that's that Neptune rising. I don't think they ever figured on that. What's also funny with the Neptune at Spica is the brightest star in the constellation Virgo. It's very, very prolific. It imbues an area with a great deal of energy to produce. And Washington, of course, produces a huge amount of paper. But it also speaks about, a purity of purpose. And the Neptune being there, it has so much to do with our belief in the concept. But remember, it's Neptune, the god of the sea. Washington, D.C. was laid out on an area that was originally very swampy. This is why one of the sections is known as Foggy Bottom. The area was very swampy. It had to be reclaimed in order to be built on. This is why the new government could get it relatively cheaply, is that it wasn't very useful as farmland or anything else, and they could get it and they could re-engineer it over a long period of time. It was placed as far south as it was because it was close to Jefferson and Washington and Madison, and they were important people, of course, in the original Congress and in the original government, and so they wanted it further south. Benjamin Franklin wanted the capital to be in Princeton, New Jersey. Well, he was from Philadelphia, and Princeton was a nice town and had wonderful pubs and restaurants and hotels to stay in. But they went for Washington, D.C., District of Columbia, even though it was a swamp. So it's really interesting how the unintended consequences. Now, one other little feature I want to make sure I mention. In the 7th house, it's not very angular, but it is in the Gogolon spot, is Saturn. Saturn was setting in the chart. And it's Saturn in Aries, and that's considered a relatively weak position. It's not weak as much as it is introverted. The United States of America has Saturn in Libra rising. It's the position of the best friend. It's the position of colleagues, the collegial relationships. Saturn in Aries is the opposite. It's the position of confidants. It's the position of secrets. It's in the 7th house. It does show maybe a tendency to have deep secrets. And I think it is a bit of our belief that there's a lot of secrets in Washington that we never get to hear about. What really happened at, Area 51 that the president knows that no one else knows. I mean, every great movie about that includes these secrets that are hidden away, But I think that's Saturn. What's interesting is that Vesta is also there, and Hygeia, all in that 7th house, which once again, it's unintended consequences. Vesta is about, belief in the individual. And I think sometimes that has worked against us because it has a lot to do with a leader's willingness to focus on their own personality, on the strength of their own personality and making the connections. It's worked in some ways. Someone like LBJ, who through the strength of his personality could make great relationships. But it sometimes works in opposition to that Saturn and Libra that was there during the United States of America, in which it is meant to be an equal partnership. So you got an opposition there, and I think it's something that they're still trying to work out over time, trying to make a more perfect union. So that's pretty much the astro portrait of Washington, D.C. I hope you found that concept of unintended consequences interesting. I found it fascinating. Come see our portraits. We do those every Tuesday, and we do our forecast, our weekly forecast, every Friday. You can find those at Planetary Calendar Astrology on YouTube. You can also find those at planetarycalendar.com, where you can also find your calendars. We're currently working on 2022, so you want to know what's going on. So until next time, be well.